Okay, here we are with Chapter 8, Political Participation and Voting. So again, Chapter 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 will be for our second midterm exam. And I think you can find some commonalities among these chapters in terms of the issues of political contacts, political influence, political participation. So here we're looking at ways in which people can directly impact the political system. And the one way that we come back to time and again, the one that's perhaps the most obvious, is voting. And for many of you, perhaps you're considering what power might you have in this political system. And we can certainly see that there are individuals and groups that have considerable amount of power in the American political system. But when it comes to demographics and when it comes to age groups, many of you are in the group that has the potential to have the most power, and that's young people. And we can measure young people in this situation as under the age of 35. This is from your text on page 284. But these days, although their turnout can still be low, the sheer number of Americans under the age of 35 means that they constitute a larger share of the electorate than baby boomers and older Americans. So, just by the numbers themselves, if you're in that age group of under the age of 35 and you find yourself perhaps feeling somewhat stuck in the ability to make a difference politically, and you say it just seems like old people or older people have all the control in the American political system, and there's no doubt when it comes to our candidates running for president, we have a large number of older Americans doing that. But when it comes to the overall votes, those under the age of 35 do in fact have the power. Will they be able to use that power? Will they use that power? Will they turn out to vote? Will they be organized? That's the issue. We will point out the contrast here between the midterm election of 2014 compared to the midterm election of 2018, and there was considerably a higher voter turnout among young Americans in the 2018 midterm election. So that did give us some indication that there can be a difference politically based on the changes in the demographics when it comes to voter turnout. So consider that when you're reading through this text and think about where the power can truly be found in the American political system if that power is actually being used. Now, when we also look at voting, we have to consider the voting system, and we'll be thinking about that here in this chapter, to some degree in Chapter 9, and certainly in Chapter 10. But as we're building our way up to the next presidential election, 2020, we can see here that while we have 50 states, 51 states and districts that will be counted for electoral votes when you count the District of Columbia, you can see here that you have some states that will clearly be more important than others. And these are what we would consider the battleground states. Most states have been very consistent. 33 states have voted for the same party in the past 5 presidential elections. That's 20 years. So you have many states in which candidates for both of these parties, operatives for both political parties, would consider that they're just really not that important to review and to invest time and money in those states. But these states here, especially the ones in red, are going to be the main battleground areas for 2020. So take that in consideration as you're considering this year going on for building up to the presidential election, why some states will matter more than others. And so I think a key part, in many ways, the analysis of the 2020 presidential election will go like this. These 4 states, we may since they're all 4, well, 3 of the 4 are in the Eastern time zone, we may fairly early on election day election evening, be able to know where the election's going by how these states turn out. Florida, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. So these states were projected based on some surveys that they were going to go for Clinton in the 2016 election and went for Trump. And so when you look over the electoral map, you have some areas here in the upper Midwest that will be the key battleground area, and then also in Florida. And there was a very slight difference between the two major candidates in 2016. And if you follow the nomination process, and of course we're now still in the in somewhat of the embryonic or even the invisible primary stage, building up to the primaries and caucuses that will start in February of 2020. These few months before, you're looking at the candidates maneuvering on the Democratic Party side of running for office. That one of the ways of looking at these potential candidates, thinking of the former Vice President Joe Biden, one of the strengths that he's bringing to his campaign, at least this is what he's talking about for potential voters, that he will be able to win in these three upper Midwest states that Trump was able to carry in 2016, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and that would make a difference. So for Democrat voters who are wanting to win the presidency in 2020, that potential to win in the electoral map may make a major difference there. Well, when we look at voting itself, there are differences across the country when it comes to the ability to vote or what you have to deal with to go cast a ballot. Some of you that have voted before, were you ever in a situation like this that we see here, where you may be waiting for hours to go cast a ballot? I've never had to do that myself for voting. And I would think for many people in many parts of the country, this is not something that you generally expect. But here we can see some places you may have to wait for quite some time. So then you're considering the logistics about voting. How many people are there to be in charge of the voting apparatuses? How many voting booths are there? Where are the voting precincts? And so some of the questions again about the opportunities to vote. We do see that there is a difference if you're having at least a de facto segregated system still to this day. People in Black America are more likely to have to wait longer than those in white America. Notice here, though, that there's a slight increase in time that you'd have to vote for those in a higher income area. And might that just suggest that people in higher income areas are more likely to vote? So there's more people voting, which leads to a greater wait time. So perhaps one of the ways of alleviating this problem is to turn to early voting that we can see there on, you can read about on page 327. When we look at the issue of voter turnout, there's plenty of opportunities for people to go vote. Most people are eligible to vote. There can be ways in which people lose that opportunity to vote by being a convicted felon. Some areas, a question of mental competency, and of course moving, and the degree of how long someone has been a resident of a state may vary and may have an impact on someone's eligibility to vote. But you can read about this on page 301. We've seen different turnouts, and perhaps registration may have some impact on that. It's interesting here in an 8-year difference that you saw the increase or decrease, well actually a decrease, excuse me, just as an example here for the state of Nevada and the caucus system. And so the candidates on the ballot, perhaps the opportunities to go vote, but you can see here this might be a very dramatic change in the impact on how a candidate would win a nomination. So this is before the general election, just to be nominated for the party and have a certain number of delegates that will be within one candidate's column there to get the nomination. In this case, you only had 80,000 people showing up in 2016 to make that determination. So could there be a case in which you, in order to increase the turnout, you make other changes in the registration policies, such as same-day registration, also called election day registration? Could you not have a case where you just have automatic registration? It's not really referenced much in your text, but as soon as someone turns 18, that they are now registered to vote, and they don't have to go through this process here. But one of the ways clearly to increase the voter turnout is to have same-day registration. The day of the election, a person can go register to vote on that day. And states that have had that do tend to have a higher voter turnout. So as we can see here, the voter turnout in some of the recent presidential elections, while not incredibly low, is pretty low compared to most other democracies around the world. We did see that in 2012, interesting shift in our demographics in terms of voting turnout. There was a higher rate among Black America than white America. It is important to keep in mind that that does not mean that there were more blacks voting than whites. That's very misleading and inaccurate to consider that. It's just that at a higher rate, they did end up having a higher percentage of the electorate overall. But we can also see here that women have had a higher percentage of the electorate than men in some of the recent presidential elections. We are clearly looking at a time in which increasingly the non-white vote has had a great deal of impact. And so this is one of the studies by a demographer, so someone who studies population, William Frey, the way he has looked at the trajectory of voting turnout among different groups. So here we can note that midterm elections, these are elections then that elect everyone in the House of Representatives, a third of the Senate, many other statewide races. In 2014, you had a very low turnout, and you had a very low turnout for Oklahoma, as we can see here, one of the lowest in the country. And that changed considerably in 2018. So how about that? So the turnout in 2014, worst in 72 years. The turnout in 2018, the highest in 52 years. So some dramatic changes occurred in those two elections from 2014 to 2018. And again, this is the focus on midterm elections. So one of the big issues is who votes in these midterm elections. And it has been a case in which it's more likely that older Americans will continue to vote at the same rates that they have voted in the presidential elections. But young Americans, those under the age of 30, by and large, are less likely to vote in the midterm elections. That was not the case, though, in 2018. It was still a pretty high turnout among the young voters. And so that may show us a continued change in the political system in the years to come. So again, when we talk about participation and the different forms of participation, the most frequent form of participation is voting. But there are other forms, putting up signs for campaign, for candidates, other forms of campaigning, putting on a bumper sticker, going door to door, and making contributions, going to political meetings. You'll see all of that mentioned on page 300 in your text. Do signs make a difference? You know, one of the ways that we can look at putting up political signs for a candidate, Perhaps it doesn't make much of a difference, although it would be quite recognizable if you had a campaign between two candidates and you saw signs only of one candidate. Then perhaps there you could say the absence of the signs may have some impact on a campaign. So certainly being a campaign volunteer, it's really a pretty high number in a way when you think about it, that roughly 1 out of every 6 Americans has said at least they felt that it was obligated to mention that they have in fact participated in a campaign, that they've been a volunteer to some degree. Again, perhaps gone door to door, passed out campaign literature, helped out in a parade, passed out signs, those kinds of areas of campaigning. A pretty high number, talking about going to political meetings, a community meeting. Is that accurate, right? You can think to yourself, how many of you that are watching this recording, listening to this recording, have you gone to a political meeting or community meeting, school board meeting? Perhaps some of you have, or you can think of your parents, that they, when you were going to high school or middle school, that there may have been some reason for them to go to a school meeting, and they did attend. So in that case, perhaps explains why you have this number. It's still pretty low, but it also tells us that those who do show up are the ones that are going to have more impact in the community issues and also the political party issues as well. It's a pretty high number too. 1 out of every 4 have contributed in some ways to money to a campaign. And I would point out that you can go to a site called OpenSecrets.com, and Open Secrets can give you information about where the money's going, who's making contributions to a candidate, and you can have access to that. Again, that site is OpenSecrets.com, and you can find out where the money is going and who's giving. Well, I did mention that there are differences in voter turnout, and here we can see some of those differences. So if our turnout's roughly at the highest, maybe 60–62%, we can see there are other countries that have a higher turnout than that. And I think what's really interesting here is it's one thing to say that you have a turnout of in the high 70s or 80%, but it's compulsory, so you'll pay a fine if you don't show up to vote. What does it say about countries like Germany, that it's not compulsory and you still have almost 70% of the public showing up to vote? That's a country that is taking voting quite seriously. Well, let's look at some explanations as to why the United States why it has some attempts to explain why we have a low voter turnout here in the United States. We don't have a voter holiday, so the day is not a day off of work. It's not like Christmas or Easter, depending on, I guess, where you're from, or New Year's Day, that you would be off. We only have, so for some people it takes some maneuvering to be able to go vote. Only 2 parties. This is called Duvernay's law. Duvernay's law would argue that, as you can see there, if you have a single district simple plurality system like we do, which is really the Anglo system, that it will only have 2 major parties. So countries that really were founded from the creations and principles of England, United States, United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, some of the best examples, will have very few competitive political parties. It's not entirely accurate. After all, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, United Kingdom generally have 2 very strong political parties, but there are other political parties that do have representation. They do have a parliamentary system, unlike ours, and they do not have the electoral college, which may explain in large part why we have really a 2-party system. But if you don't like both parties in the United States, the two major parties, then it decreases your likelihood of voting for sure here in the United States. Campaigns might be very long. Generally they are. I mean, really, the campaign has already started for 2020. It's been going on since the summer of 2020, perhaps even in the springtime. And it will certainly start to heat up even more as you get into January and February of 2020. Well, that's still almost a whole year before the election in November. United Kingdom, an election is called, and within 5 to 8 weeks they have a campaign. So perhaps people can stay more focused on the campaign, their interest level remains high, and they're more likely to go vote. But we also have a great deal of elections, and that's a good thing on one level because it's indicative of democracy. People have to run for office, but perhaps there's so many elections being called at different times of the year, obscure elections, and times in which people are not really thinking that there's a vote being held right now. So maybe we think generally in November is the time for elections, but what if you have an election in April, which you may very well have, or in February, and people may not really be thinking about elections at that time, and so the voter turnout in those special elections might be pretty low. We don't really have a political party that would be for the working class. And look at some of the established European countries. The SPD stands for the Democratic Socialist Party of, the Social Democrats of Germany. Then you have the Socialist Party there in the middle, the Labor Party in the United Kingdom. All of them are known to really focus on people who work for an hourly wage and help improve their job protection, their benefits, their retirement funds, their health care support, and more likely then that people are going to make sure that they turn out to vote in that case. And we don't really have a political party that's that strongly identified in that way here in the United States. So if voting does not seem to be a good solution to a problem for an individual or groups, then another form of trying to direct attention a certain way would be for protest. And you can read about this on page 297. There's some risk involved certainly in protest, and I think we can all consider some of the ways that can happen. Certainly just interaction with the police might lead to some injuries, but a person might be punished in other ways for protesting depending on how the protest goes and what's being done in that protest. So this is generally not the first option that people are going to take, but perhaps it's what's necessary if you're not able to be represented in some ways through the voting system. As we can see here, who votes, as I mentioned early on in this presentation, that older Americans are more likely to vote. I mean, the generally typical person of voting all the time consistently in every type of election would be an older person with a college degree and a higher income. And so if they're more likely to vote, then is this going to be the person that the political system responds to the most? And more than likely, that is going to be the situation. You can read about that on page 311. We are seeing some major changes in the last 40 or so years. When you think about Chapter 5 in the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, here we can see that black and white America vote at roughly the same percentages, have roughly the same turnouts, and that is a significant change in our political system. Not so much as we can see here in the case of Hispanic and Asian America, that their turnouts are not at the same levels. We do see some differences between men and women when it comes to politics, and this is referenced as the gender gap. Overall, women are more likely to support the Democratic Party, men more likely to support the Republican Party. So the gap between the two and these two political parties has a lot to say about the success of these two parties in certain elections. And so you can read about that, 316, 317. We see some differences here in religion. And this gap seems to be growing even greater in our American political system. And so devote some time to read through the pages of 318 and 319. It's been some major changes in the history of the United States when it comes to politics by expanding the right to vote through 3 amendments, the 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendment. If voting did not matter, then why have these limits to voting? After all, it didn't make any change if that's the attitude. Why not give everyone the right to vote? So obviously it does have some impact by considering the groups of people who were denied the right to vote. Why would they be denied something that is insignificant? So it does tell us that this can make an impact in our political system. And there's been some real struggles to try to increase this right to vote for more people. These are ways, if the goal is in the political system to try to get more people to go vote, there are ways to do that. And so it's worth considering when you have a political system that does not allow for these kinds of practices, the election day registration, permanent absentee ballot, and early voting. All of these, if they were allowed in a state, would increase voter turnout. Should that be the goal? Should we try to get more people to go vote? If so, these are clearly very successful policies. So it's worth considering, why are we not using these practices? So that's where we are here with Chapter 8 and voting and political participation. We'll be turning our attention to political parties in our next recorded lecture.